Yeah, the amazing thing is all three of these are tied together because they all were happening about the same time. Devil's Tower was, the intrusion was happening about the same time as the water was starting to recede off the continents. And at the same time, you're having mountains uplifting in southwest Wyoming. So you go from the northeast Wyoming to southwest Wyoming, and then you're depositing all the sediments in the Green River Formation, washing in all these sediments and fossils and preserving them perfectly. And then you go down to Colorado, the mountains are uplifting there as well, making Pikes Peak in the Front Range of Colorado. And you're folding these earlier flood sediments that were deposited in the earlier mega sequences, folding them up vertically and exposing them. And even the exposure of that, the erosion of that to expose it was probably part of the receding phase as well. To shear those down right down to, you can see these little thin sandstones standing up vertically. And again, all of these were happening all about the same time, all across the American West as the waters were receding, the mountains were uplifting. It's just an amazing display of the beauty that can come from a disaster, a judgment of the flood.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Creation Podcast, the show where we discuss the science that confirms Scripture. I'm your host, Trey. America is home to stunning forests, mountains, monuments, and other wondrous features. The unique beauty of many of these locations have prompted state and federal governments to designate these as national or state parks. Thousands upon thousands of travelers visit these sites every day to experience their awe-inspiring grandeur. But where did they come from? Many scientists claim that they formed slowly through uniformitarian processes. But is that true? Join us as we journey through the parks across America. In the first episode of this series, we discussed America's oldest national park, Yellowstone. In this episode, we're going to discuss three prominent features: Devil's Tower, Fossil Butte, and the Garden of the Gods. To discuss this with me today, I have ICR's resident geologist and director of research, Dr. Timothy Clarey. Thank you for being here.
Well, it's always great to be here.
For episode 2 of this 4-part series, as we discuss parks across America. Before we begin, I kind of want to discuss actually the differences between some of these designations that governments give. So Yellowstone is a national park. Two of the ones that we're discussing today are actually national monuments, and one is a national landmark. What's the difference between those?
Well, I think a lot of it has to do with whether Congress approved it or not, or the president designated it. Like monuments, the president can designate, like the very first one, Devil's Tower, Teddy Roosevelt designated as a national monument. But to make it a national park, I think he has to have an act of Congress, I believe. And then the other national landmarks, I'm not sure how those are more recent. So I'm not sure if that's just a requirement of our Department of Interior or if it needs, I'm not sure.
So it's
a tough question.
It's governmental in nature.
Right, yes.
Okay. That works.
Well, yeah, the third one, Garden of the Gods, is really owned by the city of Colorado Springs. It was given to them. But I think it's become just like historic homes can become national landmarks. It's become a national landmark, I guess.
Right. Okay.
But I'm not sure how that process occurs.
Okay. Well, we don't have to worry about that yet. That's number 3 on the list. First, we're going to look at Devil's Tower. And you had already mentioned that it was the first national monument established by Theodore Roosevelt in Wyoming, your favorite state, right?
Well, one of them.
One of them. Wyoming, Michigan, and Texas, right?
Well, those are in there.
And that was in 1906, so more than 100 years ago. And it looks very unique. There's nothing else around it, really. We'll throw a picture and maybe some stock footage of that up here, some footage that our videographer Clint has taken, and we can take a look at that. Look at that. Isn't that beautiful? It's all of art.
It really is.
Yeah.
I mean, it's stunning because it just stands there so tall, out in the prairie, kind of, so to speak. There's a couple little smaller hills behind it. If you look off in the distance to the north, that are similar, but they don't stick up through the sediments, through the rocks, as prominent as Devil's Tower.
Gotcha. So if you're just listening to this, take the opportunity to watch this podcast on YouTube or on Patreon and get a look at the visuals of some of these. All right. So from what I know of Devil's Tower, I've worked with you for years now, and I've heard you use the words columnar jointing. Mm-hmm. What is that, and how does that fit into Devil's Tower?
Well, that's one of the most prominent things you see about the tower is you see these big long lines coming down the length, kind of running vertically down it. And there's been lots of historical stories told about how those formed. But later in, I guess about 100 and some years ago, geologists figured out that those are from cooling. So as lavas and magmas will often cool, they'll often cool from top to bottom, and they'll kind of break into these somewhat equidistant, equisized hexagons or sometimes pentagons, and they'll fracture almost like a honeycomb surface, and then they'll propagate those fractures downward. And so as they propagate down, as they cool, they crack. And so things will contract and crack, but they do it very uniformly. In the case of Devil's Tower, you can see these massive columns, and that's why it's called columnar jointing, because of these big columns. Many other lava flows in Yellowstone and other places, you see a similar feature. You can go to Devil's Post Pile in California, I believe it is, other places all around there. It's very, very common. Even in Grand Canyon, as you're rafting through, you can see where the water cut through these lavas that poured down the side and kind of sheared them off. You see the insides of these lavas, and you'll see these little smaller columns. So it is a fairly common artifact of the cooling of the magmas.
So before we dive into how you believe that this particular feature came to be, let's look at some conventional ideas of how Devil's Tower was formed. How old do just conventional scientists believe that Devil's Tower is?
They believe it's around close to 50 million years old, something along that line, maybe upper 40s. They've dated the rock with radiometric dating techniques, and they find out that it's about the same age as much other volcanic activity they claim that was happening at the same time in the Rockies. And that's part of their story that they teach in all their books, that this stuff happened 50 million years ago. Yellowstone was erupting about the same time. All this volcanic activity was happening pretty much simultaneously across the American West.
And how do they believe that this piece, because you look around it, there's nothing there. You said there are some other smaller ones, but I mean, it's just stunning. It's surrounded by flat landscape. How do they believe that occurred? Well,
there's been different ideas in the past. Some people have thought it was like the inside of a volcano. That this is, after a lot of erosion, this is what you see, the very inside, sort of like the middle of a volcano.
Like a core.
Like the core of the volcano, for lack of a better word. Yeah, that's a good description of it. Others think it was what they call in geologists, like a laccolith, which is a term that implies an intrusion of magma that came in and then kind of spread out. And then most of the part that spread out, of course, he wrote it away, and all you have is just kind of the center of that intrusion that came in. So whether it was a volcano or some sort of intrusion, that's been the traditional geological explanation, but nobody really has come up with a good explanation until recently. I think there's a better one, which you may be alluding to.
Yeah, I was going to say, do you have any better ideas as to how Devil's Tower formed that doesn't rely on millions of years either?
Well, there's that as well, but we'll get to that. But the latest idea is, conventional idea is that it's what's called a Mar diatreme. And a diatreme is like an explosion. But in this case, it's a magma that kind of exploded. And how that works is the magma starting to come in to the sediments, cutting its way through the sediments, kind of melting its way in, is whatever was causing the magma to form. Groundwater ahead of it, just like at Yellowstone, we saw a lot of hydrothermal waters, and we still see the geysers. Well, that water got superheated and kind of caused an explosion, and it blasted out a huge area, which basically is the size of Devil's Tower. So suddenly you freed the magma up, so the magma was able to quickly fill that gap and float up, 700, 800 feet up very, very quickly. So it kind of blasted out the material by this hydrothermal explosion, for lack of a better terminology. And then the magma was able to quickly fill that gap, and that's why we see this kind of a plug almost of magma. And then the sediments eroded away. But we can get into the creation explanation, which I think is superior to the evolutionary one here in just a minute.
Right. So it's kind of like, it just kind of like stopped the plug, it stopped the hole in the earth.
Right. It filled it up. It basically, once the hole was there, all of a sudden it just was able to flow really quickly and filled that kind of that gap.
Okay. That makes
almost
sense.
like a plug, like a cork.
And much heavier because it's made of rock. Okay, so what about the columns? Why or how do they cool in such a manner, and what can we learn from those?
Well, the columns are, they're so big. They're actually, there's, hopefully we can show some pictures of this, but the columns are just massive. They're some of the biggest ones that I've ever seen. And I've been to, Giant's Causeway in Ireland and different places. These are just massive columns. Most people think that the bigger the columns, the slower it took to cool. But again, it's all kind of relative. What does slow mean? And as a creationist, I don't believe it was really that slow. But there is a difference between the top of the column. The columns are a little bit different size than they are towards the bottom. And so if you look carefully at it, you'll see that kind of changes. They look a little kind of not as clean and straight at the top, and then they kind of come down. They change size to a little bit. So it looks like there was maybe 2 episodes of cooling that took place. The upper part might have cooled at a little different rate than the lower part. But I still think they cooled pretty quick.
Yeah. Where did everything around this entire piece, this structure, where did it go? Because, even all of the explanations that that have been put forth, yes, it's like, and it eroded away. But why did that not erode away? Where's all the other stuff?
Well, you'd think something as fractured as that would erode away too.
Right.
And it can't last really millions of years like conventional thought puts forth. They argue that this was eroded away millions of years ago and just been standing there for a long time. I think the flood model does a better explanation of this. That a lot of that erosion happened quickly as the floodwaters were receding, and you clean the whole area away all the way down to what they call the Jurassic layers and things like that that contain some dinosaurs not too far away. And so you eroded away almost all these sediments that this thing popped into. Suddenly they were gone. And so the plug came up during what we believe was the receding phase early on. And as the water did finally recede away, it took away all the sediments and exposed this massive plug. It being igneous, it is more resistant than some of the softer sediments. If the sediments were still unlithified and still just packed down sand and shale and clays, they would erode away very, very quickly. But now we have this big igneous intrusion of some sort that formed maybe from the Mare diatreme idea, but it's got all these fractures, so even that can't last long. So it can't last millions of years with all those fractures. It would fall apart. You see all around it, there's a debris pile of pieces that are broken off. And so it was much bigger when it was first exposed. But it was exposed very quickly, we think, during the flood as the water receded. And I think that's the key to, leaving this sort of plug stand there, stand above the plains all around. And it's a pretty amazing feature because you can see it, from miles away in all directions.
Right.
And it's even been put in a few movies.
I have here that actually uniformitarians also believe that water might have played a part in sweeping away some of that erosion. They claim that a mighty current millions of years ago from the nearby Belfouche River, is that how you pronounce it? Belfouche.
I believe so.
Swept away the sediment. Is that a valid explanation?
Well, you'd have to have a lot more water in it, because right now that river is very, very small. And where did the material go? There's nothing in the area to represent all these, hundreds and hundreds of feet of sediment that had to be stripped away, 700, 800 feet of sediment. It's just gone. It's just been washed far distance away. The river today is way too small to do something like that. And it would probably just work on one side, maybe make a canyon. It wouldn't sweep away everything. So we see this complete, almost like water off a parking lot, this massive cleaning of the whole area. And all you have is this little spire sticking up. That fits better with the flood model, that this was part of the receding phase of the flood. A little river couldn't do that type of thing. Little rivers, even if it was bigger, wouldn't be able to do that. Just clean the entire basin, the landscape away that we see today.
So can you, as a summary, kind of give your interpretation in just a few sentences of how Devil's Tower came to be and why it's left?
Well, it's hard to do in a couple of sentences, but
I believe
basically, we think as flood geologists that most of the uplift of the mountains, the Black Hills, which aren't too far away from Devil's Tower, the Rockies all around it, that surround it, the basin that it's in, the Powder River Basin, all these major features were forming late in the flood year as the floodwaters were receding. even Yellowstone's erupting about the same time. And so all this activity was happening because of the rapid movement of the plates during the flood year. Lots of internal activity was happening in the mantle, and mountains were popping up and doing different things, and some areas were sinking. Well, Devil's Tower is kind of caught in the middle of all that. And it's intrusion. There was magmas that were coming in, not just in Yellowstone, but all around in the Black Hills. And this is just one of these magmas that intruded in from that turmoil in the mantle that took place a little bit earlier in the flood year. And part of that had to do with subduction and runaway subduction, that sort of thing. And so it is a little more complicated, but you got to kind of set the stage. And so these things were coming in, popping in, whether it was a Mare diatreme and kind of came in quickly, which seems the best explanation at this point. But nonetheless, all those sandstones and shales and clays that surrounded it were swept away really quickly, and they're gone. And so we believe that the final phases of the flood not only was all these mountains coming up and intrusions coming in like Devil's Tower, but you have this massive erosion event that swept all the material away, just preserving that little spire of volcanic activity, or in this case, intrusion. Not really truly volcanic, but magma nonetheless, that's still standing there amongst the plains today. So it makes it a stunning feature to see.
Yeah.
And it's very fitting that this is the first national monument to protect it and preserve it.
So it's kind of like the flood as it was receding. It just washed everything away. But Devil's Tower was strong enough to withstand that. Right,
because the sediments you got to kind of remember, in our model, the sediments still probably weren't lithified. They were just sand and clay packed down, but easily washed away by this sheet wash as the water was coming off the Rockies. To the west, we have even bigger mountains, the Bighorn Mountains. Mm-hmm. And so as the mountains are going up, they're shedding a lot of water and sediments off them, and this water was washing everything away. And that's why nothing is around the area. You don't see the remnants of those sediments. You don't see blocks of sediment. You don't see that little river. That little river, the Belforce River, can't really do it. You have to have massive sheet wash to clear the whole landscape away. Mm-hmm. And so that seems to match the flood model better than any conventional model. Our boss and president, Dr. Galuza, actually has land near Devil's Tower, and he has a beautiful view of it just a few miles south. But the best part about that piece of land he has is there's dinosaurs on that land. He's got a little remnant of the Morrison Formation, which is found throughout the American West, from almost to Canada all the way down to New Mexico and Arizona. That one big flood layer contains a lot of what's called Jurassic dinosaurs. It's been labeled as Jurassic because we use those terms to kind of know where we are, not that they're meaning that there's Jurassic period.
Right.
We call them Jurassic system. Just another level of the flood years. So the flood waters were rising, deposited this Jurassic, and there's a few remnants around. But it's interesting that our president, Dr. Galuza, has land, with a beautiful view of Devil's Tower, but also because of that little hill he's on, he's got a little remnant of the Jurassic that didn't erode away, and it contains a lot of dinosaur bones.
And you've been there.
I've been there several times. Usually we try to get up there once a year, do a little dinosaur digging, and we find a few more bones. We found Camarasaurus bones mostly, which is a long neck type of dinosaur. And then we've actually found a Allosaurus tooth. So there's at least two types of dinosaurs on his land that we're slowly excavating.
Yeah, that's really
cool. But
it's
always got the beautiful view of Devil's Tower.
Yeah. It's a monument to God's glory. Mm-hmm. It's evidence of his wrath, of the flood.
Right. It really is. I mean, it's a remnant of the flood in a lot of ways because it shows, all the things that were happening in the earth is exposed by these magmas that came up. And all the turmoil, the mountains going up, and then the sheet wash taking away all the sediments. All this ends up giving us stunning beauty today, but it was actually part of that judgment of the flood.
All right, let's move on to our next national monument. Quite a bit newer as far as the categorization of national monuments go. But Fossil Butte National Monument, established in 1972. It's about 13 square miles that contain several buttes. So what's a butte?
Well, a butte is really just a little hill with a kind of a flat top. That's all it really is. It's kind of a relative term. It's like a little, again, normally you look at a little spire that's, like Devil's Tower is too narrow. If it was much broader, a little bit bigger, they'd maybe call that a butte as well. Yeah. But you really need kind of a uplifted area. Some people call them plateaus, but if they're smaller, they'll call them buttes.
What's exciting about Fossil Butte is that they expose the Green River Formation But what is the Green River Formation, and why is that so exciting?
Well, the Green River Formation contains a lot of fish fossils, a lot of fossils of other things as well. It contains fossils of birds, it contains fossils of crocodiles, it contains fossils of plants, big, huge palm leaves and things like that, all sorts of mixed environments. But the number one fossil that's found in it is this species of herring, named after a geologist, called Nidia. They named this after him because it ends up being the most common vertebrate fossil in the world because there's millions and millions of them everywhere we look in the Green River Formation, particularly a couple of layers of it. The Green River Formation covers a huge area. It covers most of the southwest portion of Wyoming and spills over into Utah and a little bit into Colorado as well. And it's in places 2,000 feet thick. It's this massive unit that many of the evolutionists or the conventional geology interpretation is this is a big lake that built up, but you don't get that kind of deposition in a lake today over 2,000 feet thick. And you don't get the preservation that we see at Fossil Butte and the surrounding areas. You see these fish perfectly preserved. I mean, they're almost perfectly preserved layer upon layer upon layer. Sometimes they're just a little, 1/8 to 1/16 of an inch apart. And you can split rocks like we had the chance to do at ICR. Some of us went up there a few years ago and we chipped away and split rocks and found a lot of these fossils ourselves. And so there's millions and millions of these fossils. And it's what's amazing, it's a mixed environment of land and marine. You get rays, ocean rays, you get these ocean herring, and you get freshwater fish. You get like sandfish, you get paddlefish. Again, we also get the other animals, as I mentioned. You even get horses. There's even some small horses in there that they've found. And they're all completely preserved, buried very, very, very quickly, because that's how you make all fossils. You got to bury things fast and deep. But the conventional idea is that these are thin little layers, happen once a year, which makes no sense. You can't bury fossils, preserve them that well. Even the bottom of a lake, they'd be eaten by organisms or they decay away, but these are buried so fast that they seem to really imply a rapid event.
Yeah. Well, okay, so you said that they claim that it represents an ancient freshwater lake. And like you said, a lot of things don't line up with that. Let's talk about 4 major observations. You touched on some of them briefly, but let's dive a little deeper into that. 4 major observations that indicate that this unit of rock was deposited by a global flood, not over millions of years, piece by piece. So 1, let's talk about the size. You said that it covers so much land and it's so thick. Why does the size of this just provide evidence for a catastrophic event instead of the slow, gradual process?
Well, between the extent of it, area, also is the thickness. In many places, it's 2,000 feet thick. And to me, you don't see anything like that in the world today forming that type of area. You may get a big lake, but you don't see sediments that thick forming. And so it's very, very difficult to explain with just a simple lake. Also, you find a lot of minerals in it that indicate, like dolomite and other minerals and salts, that indicate this was marine. So even the conventional geologists have to say, well, part of the time it was influenced by marine waters.
Marine meaning ocean.
Marine meaning ocean, okay. Correct. And so that they even have kind of a conflict in their own story in some ways, because they have to say, well, there's some marine influence and then there was some freshwater, but most of the time it was a freshwater lake. But again, freshwater lakes today don't produce this scale of sedimentation, this scale of aerial extent. Even if you had a massive lake, you don't see 2,000 feet of sediment being deposited.
Right.
Even in a short amount of time in their world. This is supposed to take place around 50 million years ago. Again, we believe this is part of the receding phase of the flood, which we'll get more into that here in a minute.
Yeah. Okay, so you mentioned some marine minerals. What about the oil shale? How is that indicative of a catastrophe?
Well, to bury rocks that are rich in organics, again, just like the fossils we see at Fossil Butte in the surrounding area, you have to have a rapid burial. You have to deposit shales that have a lot of organics in them. And most of the oil shales and most of the oil we produce today comes from shales that contained a lot of marine algae, marine plankton. conventional people argue you can get freshwater plankton and freshwater algae as well, but it's much more common to find it in the ocean or the marine environment to do that type of thing. So to find that much oil shale, which they were going to mine years ago when oil prices were peaking, but that at today's rates, it's harder to justify because there's so much liquid oil still out there to be found through fracking and things like that, that it's not economic to mine the oil shale. But the oil shale would be a mineral resource or oil resource for us if we needed to go that far. But to get those things, again, the key to oil shales, you got to bury a lot of marine algae and plankton very, very quickly to preserve them, or they decay away as well. So you're not depositing these little marine critters are dying today. They're going to the bottom of the ocean, but they're being eaten. They're not preserved at the bottom of the ocean today. Whereas when you find in the rock record, all these shales, including the Green River shales that are full of organics, that indicates these things are buried rapidly.
Right. Because there's so many scavengers in the ocean today, and even just like bacteria. nothing would survive to form that.
And very little. And then you see these amazingly preserved fossils, but they're in layers that are just, like 1/8 or 1/16 of an inch apart, just millimeters apart. And yet they're supposed to be, one fish on top of the next. You see these stacked fish and stacked fossils. They're complete. So how do you do that without rapid deposition? Extremely rapid deposition.
They're from all over the place, ocean, freshwater, and land. I have a list here of everything that has been discovered. I'll run through it really quick.
Okay, no, good. That'll be good.
For everyone who wants to get a list of all the animals that are in the Green River Formation, we've got crocodiles, snakes, turtles, lizards, palm trees and fronds, cattails, ferns, bamboo, shrimp, crayfish, spiders, dragonflies, bees, ants, several types of birds, lemur-like mammals, bats, a tapir, small horses, stingrays, herring, sardines, perch, sandfish, and gars. That's a lot.
It's a lot of things, yeah. And every day they're out there digging. People on private land away from the national monument, they have private land. They're digging up these specimens so you can buy them. They're very common because, again, as I mentioned, the herring, the Nidia species or their genus, is the most common vertebrate fossil in the world. So for some reason, you got all these mixing of strange animals, land animals, ocean animals, lake animals. All these things are all kind of mixed together.
So all of this kind of points towards rapid burial. We have just how well preserved the fossils
are. And that's the amazing thing. That's why this is a national monument, because they wanted to preserve part of that. At least a remnant of this before, because a lot of it's privately owned. And so to preserve some of it, the federal government decided to make at least the Butte area around that kind of a small little area, but they wanted to preserve some of it for the future.
They wanted to preserve it so that we could use it to say, hey, look, this proves a worldwide flood.
Well, that's true too in some ways, but the whole formation it goes for tens of miles, actually hundreds of miles in all directions. It's to me the scale of the Green River Formation and the fossils we find in it, and the perfect preservation, layer upon layer upon layer, just again millimeters apart, stacked on top of each other, screams global flood, global event. You don't get that kind of preservation without a major catastrophic event. And you see this stacked, literally hundreds of them stacked on top of each other in many locations.
Absolutely. Well, do you have any final thoughts on Fossil Butte?
Well, Fossil Butte, again, is a spectacular monument to the flood. Just like many of these features we're talking about, there's monuments to the flood, but they give us the beauty. It's a very pretty little hill, and what's in the hill is even more important. But it is very scenic. You drive out there, it's kind of a scenic little area, a little flat-topped hill. The Green River Formation is kind of a unique little color. But what's in that Green River Formation is where it really tells the tale of the judgment of the flood. And we believe this is all part of the receding phase. The mountains were popping up all around it, which kind of created the Green River Basin, which is where the Green River Formation was deposited into it. But it's got older rocks below it as well that were deposited earlier in the flood And then as you uplifted the mountains around in all directions around it, those sediments are being shed off from those uplifts into this basin, giving it the source of sedimentation. Many of these animals came from probably the highest hills as the floodwaters reached its peak just before this was deposited.
Right.
And so on day 150 was probably just a few weeks maybe at the most before these rocks were deposited. And material was washing off from what's now Canada, bringing those lemurs and different things that probably lived at highest elevation in the pre-flood world, washing them into this basin, mixing them with all sorts of animals from all around in different directions. And you get this wonderful preservation of animals from land, sea, and probably even lakes or freshwater areas as well. So it's quite a mixture, and that mixture is best explained by the receding phase of the flood, including the preservation. The preservation is just outstanding.
You don't find fossils preserved like that?
No, not complete fossils. I mean, these are complete animals, complete horses, complete, huge frond leaves that are, 3 foot, 4 foot, 5 foot in diameter. And the fish, or you get fish eating each other in the process of swallowing it, and they're buried instantly. So you see very, very strong evidence of rapid burial, rapid deposition, but it's not just one layer, they're stacked. And it's really outstanding evidence of, the flood's, ability to preserve things so quickly, because to make a fossil, you got to bury things fast and deep.
Yeah.
And there's an example of over a massive area of billions, probably billions of fossils buried fast and deep.
Absolutely.
So to explain any other way besides the global flood or the receding phase, what we believe is part of the receding phase is very, very difficult to do on the scale of things that we see in the grandeur formation, particularly the fossil preservation.
Absolutely. Well, that leads us to our final national landmark, the Garden of the Gods. So you mentioned it is located within the city limits of Colorado Springs, and it was named Garden of the Gods by two surveyors in 1859, who they said it was fit for the gods to assemble. So that's where the name comes from, for anyone who's wondering. It hosts 4 million people a year. That's a lot of people coming to visit it. I've been there. It is beautiful. What is the Garden of the Gods? When you hear Garden of the Gods, you think of like plant life. It's not that, right?
No, it's actually these nearly vertical sandstones and rock layers that are standing up on end. And the erosion of those gives us these kind of interesting structures, but you see a lot of vertical sandstones. One of them is the Lion Sandstone, which is equivalent to many other sandstones across the American West, which we may get into in a minute. But what's outstanding is you can walk right through it. It's free. It was given to the city of Colorado Springs, and they said you can't charge money. It also reverts back to the family. I think there's some sort of a deal like that. So the city of Colorado Springs has a visitor center and parking lots they put up. But for them, it's it's not really a money-making deal. Mm-hmm. But it is outstanding preservation. They got some nice roads through it. Just to kind of walk through the rocks and the sandstones, and you can see evidence of water deposition. You can see ripples. You can see cross-bedding features that we find in rocks that were deposited by water, by moving water. And so as a flood geologist, it's also a nice, outstanding place to get a chance to look at the rocks that many times are buried deep, but these are tilted up and standing vertically, and you get a chance to really see the evidence of the water deposition of these layers.
Absolutely. All right, so none of the signage, when I went, I've been a couple of times, none of the signage mentions any sort of global flood, any sort of catastrophism, but you've already mentioned that, this appears as though it was laid down by water, it was exposed by water. So we have 3 observations that demonstrate that the Garden of the Gods was a product of a worldwide flood. We'll start with the first one. Your favorite. I've heard you say these 2 words together more than any other words other than maybe Michigan rocks.
I don't really say that. But.
No. So we have 3 observations that demonstrate that the Garden of the Gods was a product of the global flood. We'll go ahead and start with the Great Unconformity, your favorite.
It is one of my favorites because it's universal. It's on every continent. It's exposed across the American West, and you can see it just outside, just south of Garden of the Gods, park proper in Colorado Springs. And what that is you've got an erosional surface which is nearly flat. That's in this case the Pikes Peak granite, which is so-called Precambrian. And then right on top of it, you've got Cambrian sediments. And so you've got these sediments that were deposited on some sort of rapid erosional surface that was eroded flat. Now, today it's tilted a bit because of the later mountain uplift, but the surface itself is still flat. And again, the amazing thing about the Great Unconformity and why it's called that's the conventional term for it, is because it's everywhere. Wherever they find, in many places, it's the Cambrian sediments right on top of the Precambrian crystalline rock or the cores of these mountains. In this case, it's the Pikes Peak granite that the sediments are on. But it's rather amazing that this feature it's not just found in one or two spots. It's everywhere. You go around the world, you'll see the same. And many times it's the base of the Cambrian. Mm-hmm. Where you have the first fossils start showing up in the Cambrian, the so-called Cambrian explosion as well, right on top of that. And so it's really a very universal feature, and you can see it right there, just outside the park, just to the south in Colorado Springs.
And so from a creationist perspective, you're using words like Cambrian, Precambrian.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
What is your view of where this comes from? What is the Great Unconformity? Well,
unfortunately, we're kind of stuck with those words like Cambrian and Jurassic and all these things, and I always feel like these are kind of evolutionary terms, but they do still mark levels of the flood, and so we don't think of them as like a Cambrian period, like the evolutionary community would consider. 500 and some million years ago, there was this Cambrian period that the Earth existed in. That's not the case at all. This just marks the beginning of what we think is the true flood layers. Mm-hmm. And so why you have the Great Unconformity is again a little bit of a mystery, but we do see it's such a planed off surface that there had to be some massive erosion going on. And then you had immediate deposition on top of that, because you don't see gullies. Even in Precambrian crystalline rock like granite, you would still see gullies being carved if they're exposed for long periods of time.
Right.
And in many places like Grand Canyon, that's supposed to be a billion years of time between the exposing of this flat surface and then the sediments on top, which makes no sense. Why would they still be flat surface and then you deposit sediments? So we think the flood eroded down to this certain level in the Precambrian, this crystalline rock, the basement rock or the crust of the earth, and then you deposit the sediments on top, which in many places it's the Cambrian, but other times it's higher levels. It depends where you are. You can get different levels of the flood being deposited right on top of the crystalline basement. So it's not always the Cambrian on top of the Precambrian. It depends on when these were deposited.
Right.
And we often include the Cambrian in what we call the Sauk megasequence. And the Sauk megasequence is thought by most creation scientists to be the beginning of the flood, although there may be some earlier pre-Sauk megasequence, which I'm still working out in my research. But in most places, it's the Sauk. So this is the first flooding of the continents. We just start to flood parts of the continent, just parts of them, and this marks that deposition. So it's pretty amazing that, again, you get this eroded surface, almost perfectly flat, and then immediately you get these sediments put on top that contain fossils, which are called Cambrian, but that just means they contain a lot of marine fossils, ocean fossils.
Ocean fossils. Awesome. Next, we've got blanket deposits on continental scale. Now, when I hear blanket, I think of the winter and cuddling up with, hot cocoa. That's not what this means. What are we talking about? Blanket deposits on a continental scale.
Well, you can think of the vision of a blanket, but spread out. Okay. And so we're looking at some of the rock units exposed in Garden of the Gods are like the Lions Formation. The Lions Formation is the equivalent to other formations in other states. They have different names. So geologists name the same rock unit a different name, say in Colorado versus Wyoming or in Arizona. And so oftentimes it isn't until later that geologists realize, when you start looking at the different rock columns in each state, these are the same things, but then they're stuck with the names. So the Lions comes from an area in Colorado near the town of Lyons, I believe it is, and down in Arizona it's called the Coconino Sandstone.
I've heard that. I've heard you say
that.
So
the Coconino is prominent in Grand Canyon, and you can see this big sandstone layer. Well, these are the same rocks. It's the same layer. So you're in Arizona, here in Colorado, and it goes up into Wyoming. It becomes like the 10 sleep sand and those types of things. All these have been correlated together by a friend of mine, John Whitmore, who correlated all these sandstones across the American West. So you get this massive sand. Just like we talked in other episodes about the massive Jurassic layers, these would be a little bit older, earlier in the flood, maybe just a few weeks earlier, and you deposit this massive sand that covers everywhere from Wyoming all the way down to Arizona. So it's a really, really large spread out sandstone, but it's not that thick. You're looking at maybe just a few hundred feet thick. So how do you deposit these massive deposits, for lack of a better word? How do you put that much sand down? It's really not that thick, over hundreds of miles in extent in all directions, without a large flood event, a large catastrophe.
It sounds like it'd have to be a lot of water really quickly. Yeah.
And you get the same thing. I mean, and you can actually look at many of these contain, as I mentioned earlier, ripples and crossbeds, which indicate directional flow. And so you can map out the directional flow, and you see that across that massive area, multi-state area, you see same directions of flow. As you can actually map out how these sands were deposited in the direction the water was actually moving. And it's all fairly consistent. So it fits the idea that this is all deposited at one time in a common direction of flow.
Yeah.
Only the flood can offer an explanation for a deposit that big, in flow all the same direction all at the same time. Conventional geologists would argue this took millions of years to slowly have rivers and stuff transport across, and it doesn't make any sense because you have all just sand. And all the sand is showing the same direction of flow. So their model doesn't fit what we see. Only the flood model fits it. But of course, they ignore the idea that there was a flood. And so they have to come up with an alternative story. And their story is what's being told at all these national parks and monuments.
Right.
So we're here trying to tell the real story. These rocks don't fit that story that they're telling. It fits the story of the flood, the judgment of the flood.
Right. Absolutely. And speaking of the flood, the final point here is, some of these rocks are folded. And when you think of like rocks don't fold, how does that happen? Rocks don't fold.
You can try that at home.
Yeah, you'll just break it or break your hands.
That's exactly it. Rocks don't fold, and that's one of the keys to showing that these rocks were still soft or unlithified, we call them. They weren't cemented together. So these are just packed down sands. These were not sandstones at the time they were folded, because now we see them, they're almost vertical. And there was a lot of uplift to the west here. You're just in front of the Rockies, in front of Pikes Peak. Those mountains are coming up. As the floodwaters were receding in our model, these mountains were all popping up, and then you were shedding sediments off the top. But you were folding the sediments that were deposited earlier in the flood. And that's what the Lyons sandstone, the equivalent to the Coconino sandstone, that was folded up almost vertically. Sometimes there was faulting that took place because the rocks, even if you're bending packed down sand, eventually you're going to get cracks.
Yeah.
It gets too tight. You don't have so much room, the volume gets too tight, and you have to get fractures. So there are some fractures and faults to it as well. But for the most part, to fold sandstones from horizontal, the way they were deposited, to vertical, they have to be wet. There's no way to make that kind of a fold, even over millions of years. They argue that, over long periods of time you can do this, but most of these faults and folds all happen in a very, very short amount of time, even in the conventional time. So there's not enough time for these to fold. So they weren't buried deep enough to be able to behave plastically either.
Right.
And so then the flanks of the mountains that were going up. So to get the folds, the most obvious and the best explanation is that these were still unlithified or still just packed down sands, and then they were easily folded.
Awesome. So we've looked at 3 major, I'd say, places that people visit year after year. They are the spots to be, and they show the flood. They show God's wrath. They don't show millions of years. They show a receding flood that covered the entire world.
Yeah, the amazing thing is all 3 of these are tied together because they all were happening about the same time. Devil's Tower was, the intrusion was happening about the same time as the water was starting to recede off the continents. And that's what ultimately the intrusion came in, and then was the sediments are eroded away to expose that volcanic feature at Devil's Tower. And at the same time, you're having mountains uplifting in southwest Wyoming. So you go from the northeast Wyoming to southwest Wyoming. Those mountains are popping up in the Rockies at the same time. And we can tell that by what rocks are folded and what aren't. And then you're depositing all the sediments in the Green River Formation, washing in all these sediments and fossils and preserving them perfectly. And then you go down to Colorado, the mountains are uplifting there as well, making Pikes Peak in the Front Range of Colorado. And you're folding these earlier flood sediments that were deposited in the earlier mega sequences, all folding them up vertically and exposing them. And even the exposure of that, the erosion of that to expose it was probably part of the receding phase as well. To shear those down right down to, you can see these little thin sandstones standing up vertically. And again, all of these were happening all about the same time, all across the American West as the waters were receding, the mountains were uplifting. It's just an amazing display of the beauty that can come from a disaster, a judgment of the flood.
Yeah, absolutely. They are beautiful, and some of the images and videos that we've showed during this podcast are a testament to that. They are beautiful.
Yeah, Fossil Butte is probably the least visited of the three because it's kind of out there.
Yeah.
Devil's Tower is out there as well, but it's kind of on the road to Yellowstone. A lot of people swing by. But Fossil Butte is known more for its fossils that are on display all over. Many people buy their fossils. They sell them in the private lands around the monument, but that's more famous for that. So you may not get as many visitors, but everybody knows about the fossils, the fossil fish that come from
the herring.
the herring, particularly the herring.
Well, thank you so much for joining me today as we discuss these. I really do appreciate it. Do you have any final thoughts for our listeners and viewers?
I just encourage you to go out and see these things. But when you go, don't just read the signage that's there, because they're going to tell you the millions and millions of years. They're going to tell you the evolutionary story. But if you watched our broadcast, if you watch this, or if you go and buy one of our books, or look up our sites, or you can actually pick up a copy of our DVD called Carved in Stone, which shows some of these features. We actually go to Devil's Tower around here. You can actually watch this before you go. And you'll learn a little bit about the true tale, the truth of how these really did form, and most of it points right back to the flood. And so it's amazing to see these pictures don't do justice to a lot of the features like the mountains and these Devil's Tower. You've got to really go there and experience it to see it. So I encourage people to go and see these sites, but think about the judgment of the flood, but think about the beauty that's there today, even though this was part of a judgment that took place few thousand years ago.
Yeah. Absolutely. Well, you mentioned Carved in Stone. We do have a couple of resources to discuss. We've got Parks Across America. We have this book. This series of podcasts is clearly based off of some of the information in here, but this is a beautiful book, and there's all sorts of parks in there that you can see. We also have two of Dr. Clarey's resources there. We have Carved in Stone, the book, and Carved in Stone, the DVD. The book for those who read, the DVD for those who don't.
Right. But if you want to really dig into the flood and the story of the flood and the mega sequences and things like that, you can pick up a copy of this book, and it goes through the sequences. And this actually is showing, I think, some of the Coconino sandstone right over here, which is the equivalent. It's very well illustrated, and it's got lots of maps and things, but it goes through the flood step by step, sequence by sequence.
Yeah.
And explains, there's a whole chapter on the receding phase, and that's what most of our topics today were all part of the receding phase of the flood. But again, this DVD is a outstanding DVD, not just because I'm in it, but because many of our science staff are in it.
Right.
But we went across the American West, and we went to Devil's Tower, we went to the Black Hills, we went to Yellowstone, we went to the Tetons, and those are all featured in this particular 70-minute DVD. Little 5 segments in it, and it kind of goes through the flood. Starting with some of the early flood rocks, and then works our way up to the receding phase, which many of these features are that we discussed today. Many of these parks and monuments that we talked about today are. But it's amazing how God's providence gave us such beauty in the midst of a catastrophic judgment for the wickedness of humanity.
Yeah. Absolutely. Well, and I'd also recommend the Creation on Location YouTube playlist. There's several videos on there right now. There will be more as our scientists go to and fro across this world, and we get little snippets of actual on-site video of like them at places talking.
And I think that's very important because, again, if you go to these sites, you're not going to hear that side.
Yeah.
You're not going to hear the connection to the flood that we can give you, that unique connection.
Yeah.
And so as our scientists go out, myself included, we often will try to do these little spot videos to tell you really what you're seeing here, the things they're not telling you.
Yeah.
That are obvious for you to see, but until they're pointed out, you often don't notice it.
Absolutely. Well, thank you again so much for being here.
Thank you very much, Trey.
Absolutely. And thank you to all of our listeners and viewers for joining us for this episode of the Creation Podcast. We will, of course, be back in 2 weeks with another episode in this Parks Across America series. So you'll get to see me and Dr. Clarey again. I'm sure you're super excited. If you want to get the Creation Podcast a week early, or you want to get our other podcast, creation.live, 2 weeks early, you can become a member on YouTube or on Patreon. There's several other perks that you can get depending on the tier that you join at, but we encourage you to do that. If you did find this encouraging, make sure to like, subscribe, share, get the word out. Get the word out that the signs are wrong. The things that they're saying about how these features formed are wrong. They were formed in the flood, not over millions of years. But with that, I'm Trey, and we'll see you next time on the Creation Podcast. We want to say a huge thank you to our members and patrons. If you'd like to see your name here and unlock perks like early access to our podcasts, members-only polls and live streams, behind-the-scenes footage, or exclusive video content, links are in the description below.